Welcome to AIA Contract Documents, new sworn construction statement and lien waiver and release forms. This is a webinar brought to you by AIA Contract Documents. This presentation is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws. Reproduction, distribution, display, and use of the presentation without written permission of the speaker is prohibited. This program and accompanying material has been provided for general AIA contract documents informational purposes only. The information is not provided as legal advice. We always recommend that you confer with your legal counsel. And now I'm going to turn it over for our presenter for today's session, Sarah Bauer. Sarah?
Good morning, and thank you, Hasti. My name is Sarah Bauer, and I am a manager and counsel at the AIA Contract Documents program. I work in drafting and revising AIA contract documents. Prior to my time at AIA Contract Documents, I worked in private practice as a construction law attorney in Chicago, Illinois. Today, we are discussing AIA Contract Documents' newly released lien waiver and release and sworn construction statement forms. These forms are known as the G901, 902, 903, 904, and 907. Each of these new documents is a one-page form with the exception of the sworn construction statement, which contains a second page for listing subcontractors and suppliers, as well as other information. This presentation today provides useful information when using these newly released forms. But first, before we get into the documents themselves, I want to provide you with a bit of background on the purpose of these forms and how they are used in practice. As most construction professionals know, many states have laws establishing a contractor's right to assert a mechanics lien or payment bond claim after performing work on a project. Similarly, many states recognize that contractors may waive their right to file or enforce lien claims, typically by express written agreement or acknowledgement. But how do we see this played out in practice? On today's construction projects, execution of a waiver and release form is usually an integral part of getting paid in construction. These documents are usually a written and express agreement by a claimant to waive its rights to assert a lien or bond claim for work performed on a project in exchange for payment. Contractors are often contractually or statutorily required to submit these documents as a condition for payment. The name lien waiver and release is inconsistent across the US, but these forms are often referred to as waivers, releases, or lien waivers. Contractors are also often contractually or statutorily required to submit a sworn construction statement. But what exactly is this form? Well, it's usually a list of all persons or entities having performed work or provided materials on the project in furtherance of the contractor's work. These forms can be submitted with each payment application. Like lien waiver and release forms, sworn construction statements are often referred to by many different names. Typically, the forms are referred to as sworn statements, contractor's affidavits, or simply affidavit. I have mentioned that contractors and their subs are often required to submit these forms with their payment applications, but who generally requires them? Lien waiver and release requirements often originate with the project's owner and its lender. Owners usually require contractors and their subs to submit waivers as a condition for payment through the prime contract. The prime contract's flow-down provisions may then incorporate this requirement into each of the prime contractor's subcontracts. In turn, downstream subs and suppliers may be required to submit lien waiver and releases to the prime contractor as part of their payment applications. If we move up the chain of command, an owner's requirement for lien waiver and releases may be interconnected with the project's funding. This precondition may stem from the construction lender itself. So with each draw on a loan, lenders may require confirmation that no liens have been claimed against the project before funding is dispersed. Waivers can constitute confirmation that payment was made or received through a given date and that lien rights for the performed work have in fact been waived. Why are these forms required? Depending on their terms, lien waivers generally aim to protect the rights of the owner and the lender. The owner receives assurance that payment has been properly applied to the work performed on the project. Lenders also receive assurances that its collateral for the loan is free and clear of liens or encumbrances. And for sworn construction statements, who requires these? Well, it's sort of a mixed bag. Owners, lenders, prime contractors may all require sworn construction statements be submitted as part of a pay-app. Sworn statements can be used to track the payments made to subs and suppliers and in turn protect against unexpected lien claims. They can also be used to bolster and cross-check information found elsewhere in a contractor or its sub's payment application. When are lien waiver and release forms and sworn construction statements used on construction projects? Contractors and their subs and suppliers submit lien waivers and sworn construction statements as part of the pay-app process. Under sections 9.3.1 and 9.10.2 of the A201, lien waivers are specifically mentioned as part of the pay-app process. These sections may also apply to sworn statements. Under these sections, a contractor's application for payment must be supported by all data substantiating the contractor's right to payment as required by the owner or architect. Section 9.3.1 gives examples of what may constitute substantiating data to support the application for payment, such as requisitions and releases and waivers of liens from subcontractors and suppliers. Again, this may include sworn statements as well, if required by the architect or the owner. Further down, under section 9.10.2, final payment and remaining retainage shall not become due until the contractor submits to the architect receipts and releases and waivers of liens, claims, security interest, or encumbrances arising out of the contract, to the extent and in such form as may be designated by the owner. As such, under these sections, where it is required by the owner or architect, lien waivers and sworn statements from subs and suppliers may be submitted to the architect as part of the prime contractor's application for payment for either partial or final payment. After submission, these documents may be forwarded to the owner, who can then review the documents and provide confirmation to the lender that the conditions for payment have been met. Next, we can discuss state regulations on sworn construction statements and lien waiver and release forms. State regulations on these forms substantially vary from state to state. Several states require these documents to substantially follow a form that is specifically prescribed by statute. This means that the terms of the express agreement to waive and release rights are dictated by law, and substantial deviation from the statutory form may render the form unenforceable. There are 12 states that have enacted statutes prescribing lien waiver and release forms. These states are Arizona, California, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nevada, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. Throughout these 12 states, some of the statutes include that the mandated form must be substantially followed. By way of example, California's lien waiver and release statutes include this language, which is shown and highlighted on the slide. Under Section 8134 of the California Civil Code, unconditional waiver and release on progress payment forms shall be null, void, and unenforceable unless it is in substantially the following form, with the text of the, quote, notice to claimant, end quote, in at least as large a type as the largest type otherwise in the form. The statute goes on to provide the exact form. And as you can see from this language, the state statutes can be extremely specific, down to the size of the font on the form. Many states do not have statutorily prescribed lien waiver and release forms. In these states, the documents are generally interpreted under the principles of contract law. Here are two cases out of Texas interpreting North Carolina law and Ohio discussing how lien waivers are interpreted according to the same principles applied to contracts in general. This means that lien waiver and release forms are subject to the same governing principles as any other contracts in those states. Sworn construction statements vary from state to state as well. Many states have enacted statutes that address sworn construction statements, such as their validity, the required contents, and otherwise. For example, the state of Michigan prescribes a specific sworn statement form that must be used on construction projects. The state of Illinois has also enacted laws that provide the content of sworn statements, but no particular form. As I mentioned earlier, sworn statements are sometimes referred to by different names, and you can see that difference here. Illinois refers to this form as sworn statement of persons furnishing labor, services, materials, fixtures, apparatus, or machinery, forms, or form work, while at the same time, Michigan refers to this form as simply a sworn statement. Now we can discuss the variables of lien waiver and release forms. There are different variables of lien waiver and release forms that are commonly used throughout the United States. These variables are typically combined in some manner, such as a conditional lien waiver and release for progress payment or unconditional lien waiver and release for final payment. Of these variables, two types relate to the type of payment made to the contractor, and the other two relate to when the waiver of rights takes effect. Progress payment lien waiver forms are used where payment is made prior to final payment, such as a progress, interim, or partial payment, and the contractor waives its lien and payment bond rights in exchange for that progress payment. Final payment lien waiver forms are used where the payment is made for final payment and the contractor waives its lien and bond rights in exchange for final payment. Conditional lien waiver forms are used where payment is to be made and has not yet been received by the contractor, and the contractor's waiver of rights becomes effective when he or she receives payment. Then finally, unconditional lien waiver forms are used where payment has already been received by a contractor, and the contractor's waiver of rights becomes effective upon signing the form. This is because payment has already been received by the contractor. It is extremely important to thoroughly read and understand what type of lien waiver form you are signing. Final or unconditional lien waiver and release forms have been found to be binding, no matter the circumstances under which they are signed. An example of how drastic this can be is Kim versus Western Blossom Hill Investors et al., where a plaintiff's cause of action was dismissed based upon the presence of a signed unconditional final lien waiver. This case came before the United States District Court of the Western District of Washington on a motion for partial summary judgment to dismiss the plaintiff's claims relating to two construction projects. The plaintiffs included a construction company, Big Construction, and its president, Danny Kim. The defendants included owners of various multifamily housing complexes in the state of Washington. As with many construction litigation cases, there were several contracts, agreements, and so many issues between the parties. But for purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing only on the issues stemming from the signed unconditional lien waiver. In March of 2013, one of the defendants, Essex Redmond Hill NE, entered into a construction contract with the plaintiff, Big Construction, to perform full unit renovations in a multifamily housing complex called the Vesta. Defendants terminated the construction contracts in May of 2014, and the termination letter detailed certain units to be completed before the relationship was in fact terminated. The following month, in June of 2014, Big Construction signed an unconditional final lien waiver and release for the entire Vesta project. Under this lien waiver, Big acknowledged that it had been paid in full for all labor, services, materials, and equipment that it supplied to the project and property. Big unconditionally waived and released any and all liens, claims of liens, rights to liens, stop notices, rights to submit stop notices, suits, demands, claims, protests, damages, losses, and expenses of any nature whatsoever, whether under statute, in equity, or otherwise, and whether received through assignment or otherwise, against the owner of the property and all of its affiliates. Of course, in November of 2018, approximately 4 years later, plaintiffs filed suit against the defendants alleging non-payment for the work performed on the Vesta project. Plaintiffs argued that it was possible that the lien waiver was signed before the plaintiffs were in fact paid, but the court disagreed. The court relied on the signed and notarized lien waiver as sufficient evidence to bar the plaintiffs from bringing a claim for payment on the Vesta project. This case demonstrates the swift action a court will take in dismissing an action when a lien waiver has been signed, even when a party makes a claim to raise a genuine issue of material fact. It is due to these reasons that every party should take caution to fully understand the type of lien waiver that is being signed and the potential effects that may stem from it. Now we can get into the AIA Contract Documents new generic sworn construction statement and lien waiver and release forms. AIA Contract Documents is releasing 4 generic lien waiver and release forms and 1 generic sworn construction statement form. The lien waiver and release forms combine the variables I discussed earlier in this presentation, including conditional waiver and release on progress payment, unconditional waiver on progress payment, conditional release on final payment, and unconditional release on final payment. These forms include space for the users to complete identifying information of the parties, such as the contractor or subcontractor's name, its customer's name, the name of the property owner, a description of the work, the name of the project, and the property's legal description. Generally, these forms set forth that the contractor waives and releases any liens and encumbrances, rights to assert a lien or encumbrance, common law or statutory payment bond rights, stop payment notices, claims for payment, and other rights for work performed on the project and property. Certain rights are accepted, though, from being waived, which include work performed after the effective date of the waiver, which is completed by the user itself, unpaid retentions, unpaid extras, pending modifications and changes, and disputed claims. These exceptions are all to be completed by the user when filling out the form. These generic forms are editable and can be customized by the user to fit the requirements of the jurisdiction of their project. Caution should be exercised when using these forms, and you should consult with an attorney when completing and signing a lien waiver or sworn construction statement form. The G901, Conditional Waiver and Release on Progress Payment, is intended for use when the contractor is required to provide a waiver that conditionally waives and releases lien and payment bond rights for work performed through a date certain, except for the rights listed under exceptions in exchange for a progress payment. On this form, the contractor's waiver of rights is conditioned upon receipt of payment as it is specifically described in the form. The form contains prompts for the user to complete a description of the payment method, the maker and amount of the payment, and the party to whom full or partial payment will be made if it's other than the contractor itself. The G902, Unconditional Waiver and Release on Progress Payment, is intended for when the contractor is required to provide a waiver that unconditionally waives and releases lien and payment bond rights for work performed on the project through a date certain, except for the rights listed under the exceptions paragraph in exchange for a progress payment. The form contains bold language stating that the contractor acknowledges that it has been paid and has received a progress payment in a particular sum for its work performed on the project through the period covered by the progress payment. The G903, Conditional Waiver and Release on Final Payment, is intended for use when a contractor is required to provide a waiver that conditionally waives and releases lien and payment bond rights for work performed on the project, except for the rights listed under the exceptions paragraph. This would be in exchange for final payment. On this form, the contractor's waiver of rights is conditioned upon receipt of final payment as it is specifically described in the form. Similar to the G901, this form contains prompts for the user to complete a description of the payment method, the maker and amount of the payment, and the party to whom the payment will be made. The G904, Unconditional Waiver and Release on Final Payment, is intended for use when the contractor is required to provide a waiver that unconditionally waives and releases lien and payment bond rights for work performed, except for the rights listed under the exceptions paragraph. This would also be in exchange for final payment. Similar to the G902, this form contains bold language setting forth that the contractor acknowledges it has been paid and has in fact received a final payment for which it is due for the work performed on the project. For the last generic form, AIA Contract Documents has released the G907 Sworn Construction Statement. This form is intended for when a contractor is required to provide a sworn statement describing all persons or entities who have performed work or provided materials in furtherance of the contractor's work. In this form, the contractor swears that the table on the second page lists a correct description of the type of work or improvement furnished by each sub or supplier, the type of improvement furnished, the contract sum, the total sum of previous payments, the amount requested under the payment application, and the remaining balance to become due to each sub or supplier. The contractor also swears that the table is a complete statement of all persons and entities that it has contracted with to furnish labor, services, or materials to complete its work, or that might otherwise be entitled to assert a lien on the project. The second page of the G907 contains the sworn construction statement table that I referred to in the previous slide. This table contains columns for the name, address, and license number of subs, suppliers, or laborers, the type of improvement furnished, the contract sum, total previous payments made, amount requested under this payment application, and balance to become due. The table indicates that the final column, the balance to become due column, is calculated by subtracting columns B and C, which are total previous payments and amount requested under the payment application, from column A, which is the contract sum. Column totals are also contained in the last row of the table. The table is customizable to fit the needs of the project and the users. Users may add or delete rows and columns as they deem fit. At the bottom of the form, we have included an end of document, so both users and recipients can know that they have a complete table when there are multiple pages in this form. In addition to the generic form, AIA Contract Documents is also releasing new state-specific sworn construction statement and lien waiver and release forms. As I mentioned earlier, several states have enacted legislation mandating the use of a particular lien waiver and release or sworn construction statement form. We have created new forms for considered use where a project exists in one of these states. We have created a total of 35 state-specific lien waiver and sworn statements forms for these states. This includes 4 variations for Arizona, California, Florida, Michigan, Nevada, and Texas, 2 variations for Georgia, Minnesota, Missouri, and Utah, and 1 for considered use in Massachusetts, Michigan, and Wyoming. Users have the options to choose which forms are correct for the particular circumstances of their project. Users should always consult with an attorney when completing and executing a lien waiver and release or a sworn construction statement form. Lien waiver and release forms, as well as sworn construction statements, are typically brief documents that hold a considerable amount of weight. It is absolutely vital that all parties understand each representation within these forms before signing them. It is also important that users are aware of whether the forms are subject to statutory requirements. And again, we recommend that users consult with an attorney when completing or executing these forms. If you have any questions or concerns about these newly released forms, please check out our Learn and Help web pages and our YouTube page. You may also email your questions about AIA contract documents to docinfo@aia.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn more about our new lien waiver and release and sworn construction statement forms.